Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Boston, Massachusetts, in the spring of 2009 was a city alive with possibility. The historic streets buzzed with college students finishing their semesters, professionals rushing to important meetings, and tourists marveling at the blend of colonial architecture and modern innovation. The Charles River reflected the warm sunlight of approaching summer, and the cafes near Fenway Park filled with Red Sox fans debating the season's prospects. It was a time when the world felt connected in new ways. Craigslist, the online marketplace that had revolutionized how people bought, sold, and connected, had become woven into the fabric of daily life. Need furniture for your apartment? Check Craigslist. Looking for a job? Craigslist had listings. Want to offer services or find help? The website seemed like a modern miracle of convenience and community. But beneath the surface of this digital revolution, something darker was stirring. The same anonymity that made Craigslist so appealing, so freeing, also created shadows where creditors could hide. In those shadows, a man was hunting. He appeared normal, even exceptional by society's standards. He was educated, well-spoken, and engaged to be married. He had a future that gleamed with promise. Yet he was also a killer, a robber. A man who used the trust inherent in online transactions to lure victims into carefully planned traps. This is the story of Philip Markoff, the man who would become known worldwide as the Craigslist Killer. It's a story that shattered illusions about safety, about the people we think we know, and about the monsters who can hide behind the most ordinary faces. It's a case that unfolded with shocking speed, captivated a nation, and ended a way that left more questions than answers. Before we descend into the darkness of what Philip Markoff did, we need to understand the world he moved through and the lives he destroyed. Julissa Brisman was 25 years old in April 2009, and she had the kind of beauty that turned heads. Her long dark hair framed a face with striking features, warm brown eyes that could shift from playful to serious in an instant, and a smile that suggested both confidence and kindness. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a slender build that she maintained through yoga and dance. But Julissa was more than her appearance. She was intelligent, speaking both English and Spanish fluently, and she had dreams that extended far beyond her current circumstances. Those who knew her described a woman full of life, someone who loved music, particularly salsa and bachata, and who could light up a room when she danced. Julissa had come to the United States from Chile years earlier, seeking the opportunities that America promised. Like many immigrants, she worked multiple jobs to support herself and send money back to family members who still lived in South America. She had worked as a model at various points, her photographs appearing in local advertisements and promotional materials. She was studying to become a massage therapist, attending classes and accumulating the hours needed for certification. It was honest, hard work, and Julissa approached it with dedication. But there was another side to Julissa's work life, one that she kept private from most people she knew. She advertised massage services on Craigslist, offering sessions to clients who contacted her through the website. Some of these sessions were legitimate massage therapy, putting her training to use. Others were more intimate in nature, crossing into territory that existed in a legal gray area. Julissa was part of a world that millions of people participate in, but few discuss openly. A world of erotic services advertised online, of transactions that happened in hotel rooms and private spaces, of women trying to make money in ways that society both consumes and condemns. This double life was not something Julissa chose because she enjoyed it. Like many women in similar situations, she did what she felt she needed to do to survive, to pay her bills, to help her family. She was careful, or at least she tried to be. She screened clients when possible, met in hotels rather than private residences, and kept friends informed of her schedule. But on April 14, 2009, all of her precautions would prove inadequate against the man who was waiting for her. That Tuesday started like many others. Boston was experiencing pleasant spring weather, temperatures in the mid-50s, with clear skies and a gentle breeze coming off the harbor. Julissa had an appointment scheduled for the evening at the Boston Marriott Copley Place, a upscale hotel in the heart of the city's Back Bay neighborhood. The Marriott Copley was the kind of establishment that catered to business travelers and tourists with money to spend. Its sleek modern exterior rose above Huntington Avenue, and its interior featured marble floors, elegant furniture, and the quiet efficiency that expensive hotels cultivate. Julissa arrived at the hotel around 10 p.m., walking through the lobby with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. She was dressed professionally but attractively, carrying a bag with the oils and supplies she used in her massage work. The lobby was busy with guests coming and going, checking in after evening flights, heading out for late dinners in the city. No one paid particular attention to one more attractive woman crossing the polished floor toward the elevators. Security cameras captured her image as she walked, though no one would review that footage until it was far too late to save her. She took the elevator to the 20th floor, finding room 2009 without difficulty. The hallway was quiet, carpeted in patterns designed to muffle footsteps, lit with soft lighting that created an atmosphere of discretion. Julissa knocked on the door. It opened, and when she stepped inside, she crossed a threshold from which she would never return. The man who had booked the appointment was Philip Markoff, though Julissa didn't know his real name. He had contacted her through her Craigslist advertisement, using an anonymous email account that revealed nothing about his identity. Their communications had been brief and businesslike. He wanted a massage. She quoted a price. They agreed on a time and place. From Julissa's perspective, it seemed like a routine appointment, no different from dozens of others she had handled. But Philip Markoff had no intention of paying for massage services. He had no interest in the relaxation or intimacy that Julissa offered. He was there to rob her, and if necessary, to kill her. He had done this before. He would try to do it again. And as Julissa stepped into room 2009, she became part of a pattern of violence that Philip had been building for weeks. What happened in that hotel room would only be partially reconstructed later through evidence, through forensics, through the terrible logic of injury and death. But we can piece together the moments. The struggle, the horror that Julissa experienced in the last minutes of her life. The attack began almost immediately. Philip had been waiting, prepared, his mind focused on the task ahead. He likely allowed Julissa a moment to enter, to set down her bag, to perhaps exchange a few words of greeting. Then he moved. He may have had a gun already visible, or perhaps he revealed it suddenly, using the shock and fear to control the situation. Julissa would have seen the weapon and understood instantly that something was terribly wrong. Her training, her instincts, her survival mechanisms all activated in that moment. But Julissa Brisbane was not someone who surrendered easily. She fought. The physical evidence will show clear signs of a struggle. She was strong, fit from her dance training and yoga practice, and she was fighting for her life. She may have screamed, though hotel rooms are designed to contain sound, and the walls of the Marriott Copley were thick. She likely tried to reach the door, to escape into the hallway where other guests might help her. Philip had to stop her, had to control her, had to silence her. The gun discharged. The sound was enormous in the confined space of the hotel room. A crack of violence momentarily deafened both attacker and victim. The bullet struck Julissa, tearing through tissue and bone, causing damage that would prove fatal. She fell, her blood beginning to spread across the whole room carpet, her body going into shock from the trauma. Philip may have stood over her for a moment, watching as she struggled to breathe, her hands moving weakly, her eyes already beginning to lose focus. He took her belongings, her phone, her money, whatever valuable she had brought with her. Then he left, stepping over her dying body, checking the hallway to ensure no one was watching, walking calmly to the elevator as if nothing had happened. Behind him, Julissa Brisbane lay alone on the floor of room 2009, bleeding, dying, beyond any help that might arrive. It was a housekeeper who found her. The hotel employee had been responding to a guest complaint about noise, a report of what sounded like furniture being moved or perhaps dropped on the floor above. When the housekeeper knocked on the door of room 2009 and received no answer, she used her master key to enter, expecting perhaps to find an empty room, or a guest who had simply not heard the knock. Instead, she found Julissa lying in a pool of blood, clearly injured but still clinging to life. The housekeeper screamed, backing out of the room, her mind struggling to process the horror she had just witnessed. She ran to find security, to call for help, her hands shaking as she tried to explain what she had seen. Within minutes, hotel security arrived at the room, confirming the terrible discovery. They called 911, their voices urgent and tense as they reported a shooting at the Marriott Copley Place. Boston Emergency Medical Services responded with remarkable speed. Paramedics arrived at the hotel within minutes, rushing through the lobby with their equipment, taking the elevator to the 20th floor, hurrying down the hallway to room 2009. They found Julissa still alive, but barely. She had been shot in the torso, and she had lost significant amounts of blood. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and cool to the touch. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, establishing an airway, starting IV lines, applying pressure to the wound, preparing her for transport. They loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her back down to the waiting ambulance. The drive to Boston Medical Center took only minutes, but every second mattered. Julissa was rushed into the emergency department, where a trauma team was waiting. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, cutting away her clothes, assessing her injuries, pumping blood and fluids into her veins, trying desperately to stabilize her vital signs. But the damage was too severe. The bullet had struck vital organs, causing internal bleeding that the trauma team couldn't control fast enough. Despite every intervention, every procedure, every effort to save her, Julissa's condition continued to deteriorate. Her blood pressure dropped, her heart struggled to beat, and in the early morning hours of April 15, 2009, with doctors and nurses still working frantically around her, Julissa Brisman died. She was 25 years old. She had come to America seeking a better life, worked multiple jobs to support herself and help her family, and died alone in a hotel room at the hands of a stranger who saw her as nothing more than a target. The Boston Police Department had been investigating the shooting since the moment the 911 call came in. When Julissa died, the case changed from assault and robbery to homicide. Detectives from the homicide unit took over, beginning the painstaking work of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and trying to identify the killer who had murdered a young woman in one of Boston's most prestigious hotels. The investigation started at the crime scene itself. Room 2009 was sealed off as detectives and crime scene technicians moved through it with meticulous care. They photographed every inch of the room, every piece of furniture, every surface that might contain evidence. They collected the blood evidence, carefully documenting the patterns that could tell them about the struggle that had taken place. They searched for the bullet, eventually recovering it from where it had lodged after passing through Julissa's body. They dusted for fingerprints, hoping that the killer had been careless enough to leave traces of his identity on door handles, furniture, or other surfaces. They found evidence of the struggle that Julissa had put up. Furniture was displaced. Personal items were scattered. The signs of violence were clear. But physical evidence of the killer was frustratingly scarce. He had been careful, or perhaps lucky. The fingerprints they found were smudged or belonged to hotel staff and previous guests. The DNA evidence would take time to process. The bullet would need ballistics analysis. What the investigators did have was video footage. The Marriott Copley Place, like most modern hotels, had security cameras positioned throughout the property. Detectives began reviewing the footage, focusing on the time period around Julissa's arrival and the attack. They saw Julissa entering the hotel, walking through the lobby, taking the elevator up to the 20th floor. And they saw a man. He appeared on the cameras shortly before Julissa arrived. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, tall and slender with blonde hair. He wore dark clothing and moved with a casual confidence that suggested he belonged in the hotel. He checked in at the front desk, providing identification and a credit card, receiving his room key, and taking the elevator up. The quality of the footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to see his features, his build, his general appearance, and crucially, the cameras captured him leaving after the shooting. He emerged from the elevator, walked through the lobby at a normal pace, showed no signs of agitation or distress. and exited the hotel into the Boston night. He looked exactly like any other guest checking out or heading out for the evening. Nothing in his demeanor suggested that he had just killed someone. The detectives knew they were looking at their killer. But knowing what he looked like and identifying who he actually was were two different challenges. They began working with hotel records, examining the guest registry for room 2009. The room had been booked online, paid for with a credit card. But when they checked the name and card number, they hit a complication. The identification used to check and didn't match the name on the credit card. It appeared that the killer had used stolen or fraudulent identification. This suggested planning, forethought, a level of criminal sophistication that made the case more complex. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. The killer had deliberately set up a false identity to commit robbery and murder. He had booked the room in advance, contacted Julissa through Craigslist, and waited for her to arrive. This was premeditated, calculated violence. As the detectives dug deeper into the case, they began to uncover something else. The Boston Police Department had received reports of similar incidents in the weeks before Julissa's murder. Women who advertised services on Craigslist had been robbed at gunpoint in hotels. The pattern was consistent. A man would contact them through the website, arrange a meeting at a hotel, and then rob them when they arrived. The victims had been threatened with a gun but not seriously injured. They had reported the crimes, but with limited descriptions and no physical evidence. The cases had been difficult to investigate. Now, with a murder added to the pattern, everything changed. The robberies were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a series, a spree of violence committed by the same individual. The detectives realized they were hunting a serial predator who was using Craigslist as his hunting ground, targeting vulnerable women who advertised services online, exploiting their need for discretion and their reluctance to involve police. One of the earlier victims was a woman named Tricia Leffler. On April 10, 2009, just 4 days before Julissa's murder, Tricia had been robbed at gunpoint at the Westin Copley Hotel in Boston. The circumstances were eerily similar. She had advertised massage services on Craigslist. A man had contacted her and arranged an appointment. When she arrived at his hotel room, he had threatened her with a gun, tied her up, stolen her money and belongings, and fled. Tricia had been terrified but physically unharmed. She reported the robbery to police, providing a description of her attacker that matched the man seen on the Marriott Copley Place security cameras. Another victim came forward after Julissa's murder made headlines. On April 16, 2009, just 2 days after Julissa was killed, a woman in Warwick, Rhode Island reported being robbed at gunpoint in a hotel room. The attacker matched the same description. He had contacted her through Craigslist, arranged a meeting, and robbed her. This time, he had also bound her with plastic restraints before fleeing. The victim described him as a tall, blonde, well-spoken man in his 20s. She said he seemed educated, calm, and completely in control during the robbery. The pattern was clear. The same man was committing these crimes across multiple jurisdictions, targeting women who advertised services on Craigslist, using the anonymity of the internet and the discretion of hotel meetings to commit robberies. And now he had crossed the line into murder. Julissa Brisman had fought back, had struggled, and had paid for her resistance with her life. The investigation intensified. Boston police worked with Rhode Island authorities to coordinate their efforts. They compiled all the evidence from the different crime scenes, looking for connections, for details that might lead them to the killer's identity. They enhanced the security camera footage, trying to get clearer images of his face. They analyzed the email accounts he had used to contact his victims, tracing IP addresses and communication patterns. They reached out to Craigslist, requesting information about the accounts that had been used to arrange the meetings. Meanwhile, the media had gotten hold of the story. A beautiful young woman murdered in a luxury Boston hotel, killed by a man who had lured her through Craigslist. The story had every element that drives news coverage. Television stations led with the story. Newspapers ran headlines about the Craigslist killer, a nickname that immediately captured public attention. The case became national news with coverage extending far beyond Boston. The publicity served multiple purposes. It warned other women who advertised services online about the danger. It generated tips from the public, and it put enormous pressure on law enforcement to solve the case quickly. Boston's reputation as a safe, civilized city was at stake. The tourism industry was concerned. The police department needed an arrest. Detectives continued their methodical work, building the case piece by piece. They were able to trace some of the email communications to specific IP addresses. One of these addresses led them to a location that would prove crucial to the investigation. The emails had been sent from an internet connection at a location in Quincy, Massachusetts, a city just south of Boston. More specifically, the IP address corresponded to an apartment complex near the water. This was the break the investigation needed. The detectives began surveillance on the apartment complex, watching who came and went, looking for anyone who matched the description of the man on the security camera footage. They also worked with the complex management to identify residents who fit the profile. They were looking for a tall, blond man in his mid-20s, someone who lived or had regular access to an apartment in that building. The surveillance and investigation at the Quincy apartment complex yielded results faster than the detectives had anticipated. Among the residents was a young man who matched the description almost perfectly. His name was Philip Haynes Markoff, and when detectives pulled his photograph from the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles, they felt the rush of recognition that comes when pieces of a puzzle suddenly click into place. The face staring back at them from the driver's license photo was the same face they had seen on the security camera footage from the Marriott Copley Place. Philip Markoff was 23 years old, and on the surface, he appeared to be everything the stereotypical killer was not. He was a second-year medical student at Boston University School of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country. His academic record was impressive, showing consistent high grades and positive evaluations from his professors and supervisors. He was engaged to be married to a woman named Megan McAllister, a fellow medical student he had met during their undergraduate years. They had been planning a wedding for August 2009, just 4 months away, and had sent out save-the-date cards to friends and family. Philip came from a middle-class background in upstate New York, had no criminal record, and by all accounts had lived a quiet, studious life focused on achieving his goal of becoming a physician. This was not the profile of a killer. This was not the background investigators expected to find when they started hunting for a man who robbed and murdered women he met through Craigslist. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could a medical student, someone dedicated to saving lives, also be someone who took lives? How could a man planning a wedding, building a future with someone he supposedly loved, also be leading a secret life of violence? But the evidence didn't lie. The detectives compared Philip Markoff's photograph to the enhanced security camera images. The resemblance was unmistakable. They traced his movements during the relevant time periods, confirming that he had access to vehicles and opportunity to be at the crime scenes when the robberies and murder occurred. They examined his online activity, finding connections to the email accounts used to contact the victims. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Philip Markoff was their man. The detectives knew they needed to move carefully. Philip was intelligent, educated, and would likely understand the legal system well enough to protect himself if he suspected he was under investigation. They couldn't afford to alert him prematurely. They needed more evidence, enough to ensure that when they made their arrest, the case would be strong enough to lead to conviction. They obtained search warrants for Philip's apartment, his vehicles, and his electronic devices. They coordinated with prosecutors to ensure that every step of the investigation would withstand legal scrutiny. And they planned the arrest, choosing a time and place where Philip would be taken into custody with minimal risk of escape or confrontation. On April 2009, just 6 days after Julissa Brisman's murder, the pieces were in place. Philip Markoff was driving on Interstate 95 in Walpole, Massachusetts, heading south with his fiancée Megan McAllister in the passenger seat. They were on their way to Foxwoods Resort Casino in Connecticut, planning a getaway, perhaps a brief escape from the stress of medical school. The day was pleasant, traffic moving smoothly, and from all appearances they were just another young couple enjoying a drive. Behind them, unmarked police vehicles were following, waiting for the right moment. Ahead, marked units were preparing to execute a traffic stop. The coordination was precise, the result of hours of planning. When the command was given, police vehicles converged on Philip's car, lights flashing, sirens blaring, forcing him to pull over to the side of the highway. Philip must have felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system as he realized what was happening. Megan would have been confused, frightened, unable to understand why police were surrounding their vehicle with weapons drawn. Officers approached with extreme caution, treating Philip as armed and dangerous, which given the nature of his alleged crimes was entirely appropriate. Philip Markoff was ordered out of the vehicle, commanded to show his hands, to turn around, to get on his knees. He complied without resistance. Officers moved in quickly, handcuffing him, searching him for weapons, securing him in the back of a police cruiser. Megan was also removed from the vehicle, though she was treated as a witness rather than a suspect. She was crying, demanding to know what was happening, insisting that there must be some mistake. Philip was informed that he was under arrest for the murder of Jalissa Brisman and for the armed robberies of Tricia Leffler and the Rhode Island victim. He was read his Miranda rights, the familiar words that every American knows from television and movies, but that take on a different weight when spoken in real life. When freedom is ending and the machinery of the criminal justice system is beginning to turn. Philip said nothing. He invoked his right to an attorney, which was both his legal right and a smart tactical decision. From that moment forward, any interrogation would be complicated by the presence of legal representation. The police had hoped he might talk, might make statements that could be used against him, might reveal details that only the killer would know. But Philip remained silent, his face expressionless, giving nothing away. As Philip was being transported to Boston Police Headquarters for booking, search teams were executing warrants at his apartment in Quincy. The apartment he shared with Megan was modest but neat, decorated in the simple style of young professional students. There were medical textbooks on shelves, anatomy posters on walls, a laptop computer, and various personal items that reflected the life Philip and Megan had been building together. The search teams worked methodically, photographing everything, cataloging items, looking for evidence that would connect Philip to the crimes. What they found was damning. In a hollowed-out medical textbook, a darkly ironic hiding place for a medical student, they discovered a semi-automatic handgun. Ballistics testing would later confirm that this weapon had fired the bullet that killed Jalissa Brisman. The gun's very existence in Philip's possession was significant, but its location, hidden in a book about saving lives, while being the instrument of death, suggested a level of compartmentalization that was deeply disturbing. They also found plastic restraints similar to those used to bind one of the robbery victims. They discovered items of women's underwear that didn't belong to Megan, trophies, perhaps souvenirs taken from victims. On Philip's laptop computer, investigators found a digital trail that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. There were searches related to erotic services, to Craigslist postings, to the specific advertisements that the victims had placed online. There were emails sent from accounts traced back to the apartment's IP address. There were images and documents that painted a picture of a man living a double life, presenting one face to the world while hiding something far darker. The evidence from the apartment was transported to the crime lab for analysis. Meanwhile, Philip was being processed at Boston Police Headquarters. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. Throughout this process, he remained calm and composed, showing none of the emotional distress that might be expected from someone facing murder charges. Detectives observed him through security cameras, noting his demeanor, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse. They saw nothing but blank composure. The media explosion that followed Philip's arrest was unprecedented. The Craigslist killer story had already been national news, but now it had a face, a name, and a narrative that seemed almost too bizarre to be true. A medical student, handsome and engaged, arrested for murdering a woman he met through Craigslist. The juxtaposition was irresistible to news organizations. Within hours, Philip Markoff's photograph was on every major news outlet. Television stations interrupted regular programming to announce the arrest. Newspapers prepared special editions. Online news sites crashed from the volume of traffic as people searched for information about the case. The story fed into multiple cultural anxieties. It raised questions about online safety, about the dangers lurking behind anonymous internet interactions. It challenged assumptions about who could be a killer, about the masks that people wear in public while hiding their true natures. It fascinated people because Philip Markoff seemed so unlikely as a murderer. He wasn't a street criminal, wasn't from a disadvantaged background, wasn't obviously troubled or antisocial. He was someone who could have been a neighbor, a classmate, a doctor in a few years. And that made him terrifying. Megan McAllister found herself thrust into an impossible situation. The man she loved, the man she had planned to marry, had been arrested for murder. Police were telling her that Philip had been living a secret life, that he had been robbing and killing women while maintaining his facade as a dedicated medical student and loving fiancé. Everything she thought she knew about Philip was being called into question. In the immediate aftermath of Philip's arrest, Megan publicly defended him. She gave statements to the media proclaiming his innocence, describing the Philip she knew as gentle, kind, and incapable of violence. She insisted that the police had made a mistake, that the evidence had been misinterpreted, that the truth would eventually exonerate the man she loved. Her loyalty was touching, but it was also tragically misguided, as subsequent evidence would make clear. Megan visited Philip in jail, the two of them separated by glass, communicating through phones. Their wedding plans indefinitely suspended. What they said to each other in those conversations remains private, but the strain on Megan was visible. She was grieving the loss of her future, struggling to reconcile the Philip she thought she knew with the Philip the evidence suggested existed. Philip's first court appearance took place on April 21, 2009, the day after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with media, with curious spectators, with family members of Julissa Brisman seeking their first glimpse of the man accused of killing their loved one. Philip was brought in wearing handcuffs and a jail uniform, a far cry from the professional appearance he had cultivated as a medical student. He stood before the judge as the charges were read: murder in the first degree, armed robbery, kidnapping, and various related offenses. The prosecutor outlined the case against him, describing the pattern of crimes, the evidence found in his apartment, the security camera footage, and the electronic trail linking him to the victims. The defense attorney, a public defender to Philip's case until private counsel could be arranged, argued for reasonable bail, noting Philip's lack of criminal history and his ties to the community through his medical school enrollment. The judge listened to both sides and then made a decision that surprised no one familiar with the severity of the charges. Bail was denied. Philip Markoff would remain in custody pending trial. He was too dangerous to release, the evidence too strong, the risk of flight too high. Philip's expression didn't change as the ruling was announced. He was led back out of the courtroom, returning to the jail cell that would be his home for the foreseeable future. As the legal process began its slow grind forward, investigators continued building their case. They interviewed everyone who knew Philip, trying to understand how a medical student could become a killer. They spoke with his professors at Boston University, who described Philip as an above-average student, quiet but competent, showing no signs of the violence he was accused of committing. They talked to his classmates, who painted a picture of someone who kept to himself, who was focused on his studies, who seemed devoted to Megan, but didn't socialize much beyond that relationship. They interviewed Philip's family members, who were devastated by the arrest. Philip's mother and brother struggled to accept that the young man they knew'd be capable of such crimes. They described a childhood that seemed unremarkable, a family that had its challenges but nothing that would obviously predict violent criminal behavior. Philip's father had died when Philip was young, and some wondered if that loss had created psychological wounds that festered over time. But millions of people lose parents without becoming killers, and the search for simple explanations was ultimately unsatisfying. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of someone who was skilled at compartmentalization, at maintaining separate identities that never seemed to intersect. To his professors and classmates, he was the dedicated medical student. To Megan, he was the loving Phoebe. But alone, behind closed doors, with the anonymity of the internet shielding him, he became someone else entirely, a predator, a robber, a killer. The psychological profile that investigators and prosecutors were building suggested someone with psychopathic traits, superficial charm, lack of empathy, ability to lie convincingly, and a sense of entitlement that allowed him to view his victims as objects rather than people. Philip had been able to study medicine, learning about the human body and how to heal it, while simultaneously using that knowledge to harm. He had been able to plan a wedding with Megan, while secretly arranging meetings with women he intended to rob. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the escalation pattern. Philip had started with robberies, threatening his victims but not physically harming them beyond the psychological trauma of being held at gunpoint. But with Julissa Brisman, something had changed. Whether it was her resistance, her fighting back, or some internal escalation in Philip's own psychology, he had crossed the line from robbery to murder. And investigators believed that if he hadn't been caught, the violence would have continued. The robbery that occurred in Rhode Island just 2 days after Julissa's murder suggested that Philip felt no remorse, no compulsion to stop. He was going to keep hunting. The evidence against Philip continued to mount. Forensic analysis of the gun found in his apartment confirmed it was the murder weapon. DNA evidence linked him to the crime scenes. Digital forensics revealed the extent of his online activities, showing a pattern of searching for and contacting women through Craigslist dating back weeks before the first known robbery. The electronic trail was extensive and damning, showing premeditation and planning that undermined any potential defense of impulsive behavior. Prosecutors also uncovered evidence of financial motivations. Philip and Megan were both medical students, living on student loans and limited resources. Wedding planning is expensive, and there were indications that Philip was feeling financial pressure. Some of the money and items stolen from his victims appeared to have been used to fund wedding expenses, to buy engagement gifts, to maintain the appearance of a successful young couple preparing for their future together. The irony was brutal. Philip was robbing and killing to finance a wedding that would never happen. As spring turned to summer in 2009, the case against Philip Markoff seemed overwhelming. The physical evidence, the eyewitness identifications, the digital trail all pointed to his guilt. But Philip maintained his silence, refusing to confess, refusing to provide any explanation for his actions. His defense attorneys, now a private legal team hired with money scraped together by his family, faced an enormous challenge. The evidence was strong, public opinion was firmly against their client, and the most viable defense strategies seemed limited. They couldn't realistically argue that Philip was innocent, not with the mountain of evidence against him. They couldn't argue mistaken identity when the security camera footage showed his face so clearly. The best they could hope for was to challenge the admissibility of evidence, to look for procedural errors in the investigation, to perhaps negotiate a plea deal that would spare Philip the death penalty. Though Massachusetts had abolished capital punishment years earlier, the prosecution was preparing for trial, organizing their evidence, preparing their witnesses, building the narrative they would present to a jury. They would tell the story of Julissa Brisman, humanizing her, making the jury understand the life that had been taken. They would present the pattern of crimes, showing that Julissa's murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a predatory campaign. They would introduce the physical evidence, the gun, the computer records, the items taken from victims, and they would put forward witnesses, including the women Philip had robbed, who could describe their attacker and identify Philip as that man. The trial was expected to be a major media event. Court officials were preparing for extensive coverage, for crowds of spectators, for the intense public interest that high-profile murder cases generate. Legal analysts were already discussing the case on television, debating the strength of the evidence, speculating about defense strategies, and predicting the outcome. The consensus was that conviction seemed almost certain. But Philip Markoff would never stand trial. The case that had captivated a nation, that had raised profound questions about internet safety and hidden evil, would not have the courtroom resolution that many expected. Instead, it would end in a different kind of tragedy, one that would leave even more questions unanswered. In the Suffolk County Jail, where Philip was being held, he was placed in a special unit reserved for high-profile inmates and those at risk of harm from other prisoners. He was monitored regularly, though the level of observation varied depending on staffing and other factors. He received visits from his attorneys, from family members, and for a time from Megan, though those visits became less frequent as the evidence against him became impossible to deny. Philip's demeanor in jail was reportedly calm and controlled. He didn't cause problems, didn't get into conflicts with other inmates, and seemed to be adjusting to the reality of incarceration. But beneath that composed exterior, something was happening. Whether it was guilt, shame, fear of conviction, or simply the collapse of the identity he had constructed, Philip was moving toward a decision that would ensure he controlled at least one aspect of his fate. The jail's suicide prevention protocols were comprehensive but not infallible. Inmates identified as suicide risks were placed on special watch, had their cells cleared of anything that could be used for self-harm, and were checked frequently by guards. But Philip had not been identified as a particular suicide risk. He hadn't exhibited the classic warning signs that jail staff were trained to recognize. Or perhaps he had hidden his intentions with the same skill he had used to hide his crimes from those who knew him. On August 15, 2009, exactly 1 year to the day after he had proposed to Megan McAllister, Philip Markoff was found dead in his cell. He had committed suicide, using methods that were horrifyingly deliberate, and that suggested he had been planning the act for some time. He had used a pen to write messages on the wall of his cell. Messages to Megan expressing love and regret. He had used pieces of plastic he had somehow obtained to cut his wrists and ankles, targeting major blood vessels with a precision that his medical training had taught him. He had covered himself with a plastic bag to ensure that if the blood loss didn't kill him, suffocation would. The discovery of his body was shocking despite the grim reality of jail suicides being a known problem in American corrections. Guards found him during a routine check, clearly dead for some time. Surrounded by blood, his final messages scrawled on the walls. The scene was photographed, documented, investigated to ensure that there had been no foul play, that this was indeed suicide and not murder made to look like suicide. The medical examiner's report confirmed what the scene suggested. Philip Markoff had taken his own life, deliberately and with planning. The manner of his death was ruled suicide. The investigation into how he had obtained the materials to kill himself, how he had gone undetected while preparing for the act, led to questions about jail protocols and supervision. But ultimately, Philip had made a choice, had decided that death was preferable to facing trial, conviction, and spending the rest of his life in prison. News of Philip's suicide spread quickly. Media outlets that had been preparing to cover his trial instead ran stories about his death. The reaction was mixed. Some felt that Philip had taken the coward's way out, denying his victims and their families the justice that a trial would have provided. Others saw his suicide as a kind of confession, an admission of guilt that avoided the need for trial. Still others wondered if the truth had died with Philip, if there were aspects of his crimes, his motivations, his psychology that would now never be understood. Megan McAllister released a brief statement expressing shock and grief at Philip's death. By this point, she had broken off their engagement, had come to accept that the man she loved was indeed guilty of terrible crimes. But losing him to suicide added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. She would spend years trying to rebuild her life, to move past the infamy of being known as the Craigslist killer's fiancée. Julissa Brisman's family expressed frustration that Philip had avoided accountability. They had wanted to face him in court, to confront the man who had killed their daughter, sister, loved one. They had wanted to hear a jury pronounce him guilty, to see him sentenced to life in prison. His suicide denied them that closure, that sense that justice had been served. The other victims, the women Philip had robbed, also struggled with his death. They had been preparing to testify, to face their attacker in court, to reclaim some of the power he had taken from them. His suicide left them without that opportunity. The legal cases against him were effectively closed with his death. There would be no trial, no conviction, no official legal declaration of his guilt. Even though the evidence was overwhelming, the aftermath of Philip Markoff's suicide left investigators, prosecutors, and the public grappling with profound questions about who he really was and what had driven him to commit such horrific crimes. The investigation into his background intensified even after his death, not for the purpose of prosecution anymore, but to understand, to learn, to perhaps identify warning signs that had been missed. What emerged was a complex picture of a young man whose outward success masked deep psychological issues and a capacity for violence that no one in his life had recognized until it was too late. Philip Haynes Markoff was born on February 12, 1986, in Sherrill, New York, a small city in the central part of the state. Sherrill was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where the local high school sports teams were a source of community pride, and where young people often dreamed of leaving for bigger opportunities. Philip's family was middle class, his father working as a dentist and his mother as a homemaker. He had one older brother, and by all accounts, his early childhood was unremarkable in the way that most childhoods are unremarkable, a mixture of school, friends, family activities, and the ordinary rhythms of suburban American life. But there was tragedy early in Philip's life that would later be examined for its potential psychological impact. When Philip was just 11 years old, his father died. The loss of a parent during childhood is a profound trauma, one that shapes development in ways both obvious and subtle. Some psychologists who later analyzed Philip's case wondered if this early loss had created attachment issues, had made him struggle with emotional regulation, had perhaps planted seeds of anger or emptiness that would later manifest in destructive ways. But millions of children lose parents without becoming killers, and the direct causal connection was impossible to establish with certainty. After his father's death, Philip's mother remarried, and the family dynamics shifted. Philip and his brother now had a stepfather, a new family configuration that required adjustment. Friends from this period would later describe Philip as having become more withdrawn after his father's death, less outgoing, more focused on academic achievement as perhaps a way to gain approval or to create structure in a life that had been disrupted by loss. But again, these observations came with the benefit of hindsight, colored by knowledge of what Philip would later become. In high school, Philip was a good student, not brilliant but certainly above average. He took advanced placement classes, participated in the bowling team, and seemed to be on a conventional path toward college and career success. Teachers remembered him as quiet and polite, someone who completed assignments on time and didn't cause trouble. He had friends, though he wasn't part of the most popular social groups. He dated occasionally, though no serious relationships from this period stood out in anyone's memory. He was, in many ways, invisible in the way that many adolescents are invisible, not troubled enough to raise concerns, not exceptional enough to draw special attention. Philip graduated from Verne Verona, Sherrill High School in 2004 and enrolled at the State University of New York at Albany, known as SUNY Albany. He declared a pre-med track, intending to fulfill the requirements needed for medical school admission. College was where Philip seemed to find his stride. His grades improved, reaching the level needed to be competitive for medical school. He joined the Pre-Medical Society, volunteered at local hospitals to gain clinical experience, and presented the image of a dedicated student serious about becoming a physician. It was at SUNY Albany that Philip met Megan Mellister. She was also on the pre-med track, ambitious and intelligent, planning a future in medicine. They met through mutual friends and quickly formed a connection. Friends who knew them as a couple described their relationship as intense, with Philip seeming particularly devoted to Megan. He was attentive, romantic in traditional ways, planning dates and giving gifts. Megan appeared to bring out a softer side of Philip, and those who knew them thought they were matched, two serious students building toward a shared future. Philip and Megan's relationship progressed through their undergraduate years. They studied together, supported each other through the stress of pre med coursework, and made plans for applying to medical schools. When it came time to choose where to attend medical school, they coordinated their decisions, both ultimately enrolling at Boston University School of Medicine. This required significant commitment, as medical school is demanding enough without trying to maintain a serious relationship, but they seemed determined to make it work. They moved to Boston in 2007, finding an apartment in Quincy where they could live together while attending classes. The cost of medical school is substantial, and both Philip and Megan were relying on student loans, limited family support, and part-time work to finance their education. The financial pressure was real and constant, a background stress that never entirely went away. But this too is common among medical students, and most find ways to manage the pressure without turning to crime. Philip's performance in medical school was solid if not spectacular. He passed his courses, performed adequately in clinical rotations, and gave no indication to his professors or supervisors that anything was wrong. Medical education includes training in professionalism, in ethics, and the sacred duty of physicians to first do no harm. Philip sat through these lectures, participated in discussions about patient care and medical ethics, and apparently absorbed none of it in any meaningful way, or perhaps absorbed it only as information to be learned for exams rather than principles to guide behavior. In the spring of 2008, Philip proposed to Megan. They had been together for several years, had supported each other through undergraduate and into medical school, and marriage seemed like the natural next step. Megan accepted, and they began planning a wedding for August 2009, to take place after their second year of medical school was complete. They created a wedding website, sent save-the-date cards, chose a venue, and made all the arrangements that engaged couples make. To everyone who knew them, they appeared to be a happy couple building a life together. But at some point during this period, something changed in Philip, or perhaps something that had always been there began to manifest more clearly. The exact timeline is difficult to establish, but investigators believe that Philip began visiting Craigslist's erotic services section sometime in late 2008 or early 2009. Initially, he had been browsing out of curiosity or sexual interest. The site was easily accessible, offered anonymity, and featured advertisements from women offering various services. For someone like Philip, who projected an image of respectability and propriety, the anonymous nature of these interactions may have been appealing. But at some point, Philip's interest shifted from potential customer to predator. Instead of seeing the women advertising on Craigslist as service providers, he began seeing them as targets. The psychology of this shift is complex, but it likely involved several factors. The women advertising erotic services were vulnerable in specific ways. They were meeting strangers in private locations. They often carried cash. They were unlikely to report crimes to police because of the legal gray area in which they operated and the social stigma attached to their work. For someone planning robberies, they were nearly ideal victims. Philip's first known crime was the robbery of Tricia Leffler on April 10, 2009. But investigators suspected there may have been earlier incidents that went unreported or that occurred in other jurisdictions and weren't connected to Philip. The robbery of Tricia followed a pattern that Philip would repeat. He contacted her through Craigslist using an anonymous email account. He arranged to meet her at a hotel, the Westin Copley Place in Boston. He booked a room using what appeared to be legitimate identification, but may have involved fraudulent credit cards or stolen identity information. When Tricia arrived, Philip threatened her with a gun, tied her up with plastic restraints, and robbed her of approximately $800 in cash along with personal items. The crime showed planning and forethought. Philip had obtained a gun, though how he acquired it remains unclear, since he had no criminal record that would have facilitated a legal purchase and no known connections to illegal weapons dealers. He had purchased plastic restraints, the kind used by police and security personnel. He had created fake email accounts to maintain anonymity. He had chosen his victim carefully, selecting someone whose occupation made her unlikely to involve police, and he had executed the robbery efficiently, taking what he wanted and leaving before hotel security or other guests could intervene. The psychological rush from successfully committing the robbery may have been intoxicating for Philip. He had gotten away with it. He had money that he desperately needed for wedding expenses and daily life, and he had experienced a sense of power and control that was perhaps missing from other areas of his existence. In medical school, he was average one student among many. In his relationship with Megan, he may have felt pressure to live up to her expectations and his own image of what he should be. But in the hotel room with Trisha, with a gun in his hand and a woman terrified before him, he was completely in control. 4 days later, on April 14, Philip struck again. This time his victim was Julissa Brisman, and this time the outcome would be tragically different. The circumstances leading to their encounter followed the same pattern. Philip found Julissa's advertisement on Craigslist. He contacted her, arranging a meeting at the Marriott Copley Place. He booked a room, number 2009, and waited for her to arrive. But something went wrong. Julissa, whether through intuition, experience, or simple courage, recognized the danger and fought back. The physical evidence from the crime scene told the story of a struggle. Julissa didn't simply submit to being robbed. She fought, she resisted, she tried to escape or defend herself. This was not part of Philip's plan. His previous robbery had gone smoothly, with Trisha complying out of fear and self-preservation. But Julissa's resistance forced Philip to make a choice, and the choice he made revealed the depth of his depravity. Rather than flee, rather than simply overcome her resistance and escape, he shot her. The gun he had used as a threat became an instrument of murder. The bullet that killed Julissa was fired at close range, tearing through her torso and causing massive internal damage. She fell bleeding, dying, her life ending on the floor of a hotel room, far from the family she supported in Chile, far from the dreams she had carried with her to America. Philip took her belongings and left, stepping over her body, walking calmly through the hotel lobby, and disappearing into the Boston night. He went home to Megan, to the apartment they shared, to the life they were building together. And he said nothing about what he had done, the psychological compartmentalization required to commit murder, and then return to normal life is extraordinary. Philip went to classes the next day. He studied, interacted with classmates and professors, maintained his facade of being a dedicated medical student. He spent time with Megan, perhaps discussing wedding plans or daily concerns, all while keeping the secret of having killed someone just hours before. This ability to separate his actions from his public identity suggests either profound psychological dissociation or psychopathic traits that allowed him to feel no genuine empathy or remorse. 2 days after murdering Julissa, Philip committed another robbery in Rhode Island. A woman advertising services on Craigslist met him at a hotel in Warwick, and he followed his established pattern, threatening her with the gun, binding her with restraints, and stealing her money and belongings. The fact that he committed this crime so soon after killing Julissa indicates that he felt no compulsion to stop, no guilt that have prevented him from continuing his predatory behavior. If anything, he may have been emboldened by having crossed the line into murder and escaped immediate detection. But the investigation was closing in. The Boston police were analyzing security footage, tracing digital communications, and building the case that would lead them to Philip's door. The publicity around Julissa's murder may have made Philip nervous, or he may have believed that his careful planning and use of anonymous communications would protect him. Either way, he was making plans to leave Boston temporarily, to take a trip with Megan to Foxwoods Casino, perhaps to create distance from the crime scenes or simply to maintain the appearance of normalcy. When Philip was arrested on April 20, just 10 days after his first known robbery and 6 days after murdering Julissa, his double life came crashing down. The arrest on the highway, with police cars surrounding his vehicle and officers ordering him out at gunpoint, must have been the moment when Philip realized that the game was over. His carefully constructed identity as a medical student and devoted fiancé was about to be publicly destroyed. His future, which had looked so promising just weeks before, was suddenly reduced to the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. The evidence found in Philip's apartment confirmed what investigators already suspected. The gun that had killed Julissa was hidden in a hollowed-out medical textbook, a detail so symbolically loaded that it seemed almost too on the nose. Here was a book meant to teach healing, violated to conceal an instrument of death. The plastic restraints, the items taken from victims, the laptop computer with its damning digital history, all painted a picture of a man living a secret life of violence, while maintaining an outward appearance of respectability. Philip's silence following his arrest was strategic, but also perhaps necessary for his psychological survival. To confess would be to admit to himself and the world what he had become. To maintain innocence, to say nothing, allowed him to preserve some fragment of the identity he had constructed, even if that identity was now clearly false to everyone else. His defense attorneys advised silence, but even without that advice, it's unclear whether Philip would have been capable of honest self-reflection and confession. The months between Philip's arrest in April and his suicide in August were a period of psychological deterioration, though the extent of this was not fully recognized by jail staff at the time. Philip was visited by his attorneys, who were preparing a defense that they must have known was nearly hopeless given the overwhelming evidence against him. He was visited by family members, his mother and brother, who were struggling to reconcile the Philip they thought they knew with the Philip who stood accused of murder. And for a time, he was visited by Megan. The visits with Megan must have been excruciating for both of them. Megan was trying to understand, trying to believe that the man she loved could not have done these terrible things. But the evidence was overwhelming, and each new revelation made denial more difficult to maintain. She had shared an apartment with Philip, had slept beside him, had made love with him, had planned a future with him. And all the while, he had been hiding a secret life that now seemed incomprehensible. How could she not have known? How could she have missed the signs? These questions would haunt her long after Philip's death. Philip's psychological state during this period is difficult to assess from the outside, but certain facts are suggestive. He was facing life in prison, the complete destruction of his career plans, the loss of his relationship with Megan, and the knowledge that he would be forever known as the Craigslist killer, a monster in the public imagination. For someone who had invested so much in presenting a certain image to the world, this collapse of identity may have been unbearable. There is also the question of guilt. Did Philip feel genuine remorse for killing Jalissa Brisman and traumatizing the other women he had robbed? Or was his distress primarily about being caught, about the consequences he now faced rather than the harm he had caused? Psychopaths, individuals with profound deficits in empathy and conscience, often feel no genuine guilt even when they intellectually understand that they have done wrong. They may feel sorry for themselves, frustrated at being caught, anxious about punishment, but not truly remorseful in the way that people with normal moral emotions experience remorse. Philip's decision to commit suicide can be understood from multiple perspectives. It may have been an act of despair, a recognition that his life as he had known it was over, and that the future held nothing but decades of imprisonment and infamy. It may have been an act of control, a final assertion of power over his own fate when everything else had been taken from him. It may have been an escape from guilt and shame that he could not bear to face. Or it may have been a final act of selfishness, denying his victims and their families the justice of seeing him convicted and punished. The manner of Philip's suicide was particularly disturbing. He used a pen to write messages on the wall of his cell, declaring his love for Megan and expressing what seemed to be regret, though the specific contents of these messages were not fully disclosed to the public. He then used pieces of plastic he had somehow obtained to methodically cut his wrists and ankles, targeting major blood vessels with the precision that his medical training had taught him. He knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum blood loss. He knew how long it would take to lose consciousness, and he covered himself with a plastic bag to ensure that if he somehow survived the blood loss, suffocation would finish the job. This was not an impulsive act of desperation. This was planned, calculated self-destruction. The investigation into how Philip obtained the materials to commit suicide, and how he was able to carry out the act without being stopped raised serious questions about jail procedures. Suffolk County Jail had protocols in place to prevent suicides, including regular checks on inmates and restrictions on items that could be used for self-harm. But Philip had not been classified as a high suicide risk, and the level of monitoring he received was apparently insufficient to detect his preparations or intervene before it was too late. Some critics argued that a medical student accused of murder should have automatically been considered a suicide risk, given the dramatic change in circumstances and the bleak future he faced. Others pointed out that jail resources are limited, that suicide prevention is challenging in any correctional setting, and that determined individuals can sometimes find ways to harm themselves despite precautions. The debate over whether Philip's suicide was preventable or whether it represented a systemic failure in the jail's duty of care continued for months after his death. For Julissa Brisman's family, Philip's suicide was a devastating blow. They had been preparing for trial, gathering their strength to face the man who had killed their daughter, ready to see justice served through the legal system. His death denied them that opportunity. There would be no trial, no moment when they could look Philip in the eye and tell him what his actions had cost them. No verdict of guilty pronounced by a jury. No sentence of life without parole that would at least provide the cold comfort of knowing that the killer was being punished. Instead, there was just emptiness. The knowledge that Philip had escaped accountability by choosing death over facing the consequences of his actions. Julissa's mother released a statement through her attorney expressing profound grief, not just at the loss of her daughter, but at the loss of the chance to see justice done. She spoke of Julissa's dreams, her plans to help her family, her hard work in pursuing a better life. She spoke of the phone calls from America that had suddenly stopped, the silence that had eventually been filled with the worst news a mother can receive. And she spoke of the anger and frustration at knowing that the man who had taken her daughter's life had also taken away her chance to see him held accountable. Tricia Leffler and the other robbery victims also struggled with Philip's suicide. They had been preparing to testify, to face their attacker in court, to reclaim some sense of power and control by speaking their truth in a public forum. Philip's death took that away from them. There would be no trial testimony, no cross-examination where his defense attorneys would try to discredit them, but where they could stand firm in their truth. There would be no satisfaction of hearing a judge sentence Philip to prison. There was just an anticlimactic ending that left them without closure. The media coverage of Philip's suicide was extensive, with news organizations analyzing every aspect of his death and its implications. Some outlets treated it as the final chapter in the Craigslist killer story, a case that had ended not with a trial, but with the defendant taking his own life. Others saw it as the beginning of a new mystery, raising questions about Philip's motives, his psychology, and whether there might be additional victims whose cases had not been connected to him. Still others focused on the broader implications for online safety, using Philip's story as a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking on websites like Craigslist. Craigslist itself came under scrutiny following the case. Critics argued that the site's erotic services section facilitated prostitution and created dangerous situations for both service providers and clients. There were calls for Craigslist to shut down the section entirely or to implement stronger screening and verification processes. The company responded with some changes, eventually replacing the erotic services section with an adult services category that required additional verification, though critics argued these changes were cosmetic rather than substantive. The debate over Craigslist's responsibility for crimes committed through its platform continues to this day, part of the larger discussion about the responsibilities of internet companies to prevent harmful uses of their services. The psychological autopsy of Philip Markoff, conducted informally by investigators, forensic psychologists, and criminal profilers in the months following his death, revealed a complex picture of a man whose internal world was far darker and more troubled than his external presentation suggested. The question that haunted everyone who studied the case was simple yet profound: how could someone who appeared so normal, so successful, so well adjusted on the surface harbor such capacity for violence? The answer, as is often the case with such questions, was neither simple nor entirely satisfying. One of the most striking aspects of Philip's psychology was his apparent ability to compartmentalize different aspects of his identity. To his professors and classmates at Boston University School of Medicine, he was Philip the dedicated student, someone who attended lectures, completed assignments, and performed adequately in clinical rotations. To Megan and her family, he was Philip the loving fiancé, someone who planned romantic dates, talked about their future together, and seemed genuinely committed to building a life with her. To his own family, he was Philip the son and brother who had overcome the early loss of his father and was achieving the American dream of becoming a physician. But alone, in the privacy of his apartment or hotel rooms, he was Philip the predator, someone who trolled Craigslist for victims, planned robberies with chilling precision, and ultimately committed murder. This kind of compartmentalization is often associated with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Individuals with these conditions can present vastly different personas to different people, adapting their behavior to whatever situation they find themselves in, all while feeling no genuine emotional connection to others. They can mimic normal emotional responses, can say the right things and make the right gestures, but these are performances rather than authentic expressions of feeling. For Philip, it's likely that his relationship with Megan, his dedication to medical school, and his interactions with family and friends were all in some sense performances, ways of maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while hiding his true nature. But what was Philip's true nature? Investigators and psychologists who studied the case identified several key traits. First, there was the evident lack of empathy. To rob someone at gunpoint, to terrorize them, to tie them up and steal from them, requires an inability or unwillingness to feel the victim's fear and suffering. To shoot Julissa Brisman and then step over her dying body to leave the hotel room requires a profound disconnection from normal human emotion. Philip's actions demonstrated that he viewed his victims as objects to be used rather than as human beings with feelings, families, and futures. Second, there was the sense of entitlement. Philip seemed to believe that he deserved things, whether that was money he hadn't earned or sexual access to women who hadn't consented. His decision to rob rather than to find legitimate ways to address his financial pressures suggests that he felt rules didn't apply to him in the same way they applied to others. This sense of being special, of being above ordinary moral constraints, is another hallmark of psychopathic personality structure. Third, there was the evident pleasure or excitement he derived from his crimes. The fact that Philip committed multiple robberies, escalating to murder, and then continued robbing even after killing someone, suggests that he was driven by more than just financial need. If money had been the only motive, there were countless other ways a medical student could have addressed financial pressure. Legal means ranging from additional student loans to part-time work to postponing the expensive wedding. But Philip chose crime and he repeated it, suggesting that the experience itself, the power and control and perhaps the thrill, was rewarding in ways that went beyond the monetary gain. Fourth, there was the evident capacity for deception and manipulation. Philip maintained his facade for years, lying to everyone in his life about who he really was and what he was doing. He created false online identities to contact his victims. He used fraudulent methods to book hotel rooms. He lied to Megan, to his family, to his classmates and professors. And he apparently did all of this without visible signs of stress or guilt that would have alerted those around him that something was wrong. This ability to lie convincingly and consistently is another characteristic associated with psychopathy. But diagnosing someone posthumously, especially someone who never underwent formal psychological evaluation, is inherently speculative. We can observe behaviors and make inferences about the psychological traits that might have produced those behaviors, but we can never know with certainty what was happening in Philip's mind. Did he feel anything when he shot Julissa? Did he experience remorse later alone in his apartment, or did he simply feel relief at having escaped detection? Did he love Megan in any genuine sense, or was his relationship with her simply another aspect of the mask he wore to appear normal? These questions remain unanswered and unanswerable. One aspect of Philip's background that received considerable attention was his early loss of his father. Attachment theory suggests that early childhood trauma, particularly the loss of a primary caregiver, can interfere with the development of normal emotional bonds and can create long-lasting psychological vulnerabilities. Some psychologists speculated that his father's death, when Philip was 11 years old, may have been a formative trauma that contributed to his later inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. The timing was particularly significant because 11 is an age when children are developing more complex social and emotional capacities, and the disruption of losing a parent during this critical period could potentially have lasting effects. But again, millions of children experience parental loss without becoming killers. The relationship between early trauma and later violence is neither simple nor deterministic. Many factors influence whether a child who experiences trauma will develop normally or will develop psychological problems. These factors include the support system available after the trauma, the child's innate resilience, the quality of relationships with remaining caregivers, and countless other variables. In Philip's case, we know he had a mother who remained involved in his life, a brother, and eventually a stepfather. We know he functioned well enough academically to succeed in school and get into medical school. But we don't know what was happening in his internal emotional world, what attachments formed or failed to form, what anger or emptiness might have been growing beneath the surface. Another factor that investigators considered was Philip's sexual psychology. His crimes all involved women who advertised sexual services online. His victims were engaged in or associated with the sex industry in various ways. The items taken from victims included women's underwear, which Philip kept as trophies, suggesting a sexual component to his crimes beyond simple robbery. Some profilers suggested that Philip may have had complex and perhaps disturbed sexual feelings, possibly involving anger toward women, possibly involving a desire to dominate and control, possibly involving fantasies that he acted out through his crimes. The relationship between sexual psychology and violence is well established in criminology. Many serial killers and sexual predators have been found to have elaborate fantasy lives that they eventually act out in increasingly violent ways. The progression typically starts with fantasy, moves to non-violent acting out like voyeurism or theft of intimate items, and can escalate to assault and murder. Philip's progression fits this pattern to some extent. He may have started by browsing Craigslist out of sexual curiosity, developed fantasies about dominating the women he saw advertised there, and then escalated to actually committing crimes against them. But there's also a simpler explanation that doesn't require complex psychological theories. Philip needed money. Women advertising on Craigslist were vulnerable targets who were unlikely to report crimes to police. Robbing them was, from a purely practical criminal perspective, a relatively low-risk way to get cash. The sexual component may have been secondary to the financial motive, or it may have been an added element that made the crimes more appealing to him. We can't know for certain without access to Philip's own account of his motivations, and he chose silence and then death over explanation. The impact of Philip's crimes and death extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Megan McAllister found herself thrust into an impossible situation. Simultaneously mourning the loss of the man she had planned to marry and grappling with the horrifying reality of who that man actually was. In the immediate aftermath of Philip's arrest, Megan had defended him publicly, unable or unwilling to believe that the person she loved could be capable of such crimes. But as the evidence mounted, as the truth became undeniable, she had to confront the fact that she had been living with a killer, sleeping beside him, planning a future with him, all while he was leading a secret life of violence. The psychological trauma of this revelation is difficult to overstate. Megan had to question everything she thought she knew about Philip, about their relationship, about her own judgment and perception. She had to wonder whether there had been signs she missed, whether she should have known something was wrong, whether she bore any responsibility for failing to recognize the monster hiding behind the mask of the man she loved. And she had to do all of this in the harsh glare of media attention, with her name and face appearing in news coverage around the world, forever linked to Philip's crimes through their engagement. Megan eventually broke off the engagement and released a statement acknowledging the overwhelming evidence of Philip's guilt. She expressed shock and grief, both at the loss of the future she had imagined, and at the horrifying reality of what Philip had done. She extended condolences to Julissa Brisman's family and to the other victims. And then she largely disappeared from public view, trying to rebuild her life away from the spotlight that Philip's crimes had thrust upon her. She would eventually complete medical school, though at a different institution, and would go on to practice medicine under her maiden name, rather than the name she had planned to take when she married Philip. But the trauma of those months, the betrayal and confusion and grief, would mark her forever. Philip's family also struggled in the aftermath of his crimes and death. His mother and brother had to confront the reality that the son and brother they thought they knew was capable of terrible violence. They had to endure media scrutiny, public judgment, and the private agony of wondering whether they had missed signs, whether they could have done something to prevent Philip's descent into criminality, whether there was anything in his upbringing that had contributed to what he became. Like Megan, they largely withdrew from public life, grieving privately while the world judged and speculated about their son and brother. The broader community was also affected. Boston University School of Medicine had to grapple with the fact that one of their students was a killer. The institution reviewed its admissions processes, its student evaluation procedures, and its mechanisms for identifying students who might be struggling with psychological issues. But the reality is that Philip had been a functional student who gave no obvious signs of being dangerous. He passed his classes, showed up for clinical rotations, and behaved professionally in academic settings. Without some kind of incident that would have triggered closer scrutiny, there was no reason for the school to have identified him as a risk. The medical school community, students and faculty alike, had to process the cognitive dissonance of knowing that someone training to heal could also be someone who killed. Medicine attracts people who are intelligent, driven, and capable of deferred gratification, all traits that Philip possessed. But it also presumes a fundamental ethical commitment to helping others, to respecting human life and dignity. Philip's crimes revealed that he lacked this ethical foundation, that his choice of medicine as a career was perhaps more about status and achievement than about any genuine calling to serve others. The women who worked in the sex industry, particularly those who advertised on Craigslist, found themselves in a difficult position after Philip's crimes became public. On one hand, the case brought attention to the very real dangers they faced, the vulnerability that came with meeting strangers in private locations, the reluctance to involve police because of the stigma and legal uncertainties surrounding their work. On the other hand, the media coverage often portrayed them in problematic ways, sometimes suggesting that their choice of work somehow made them less deserving of sympathy or justice. Julissa Brisman was often described in news coverage primarily in terms of her work advertising massage services, with less attention to her as a full human being with dreams, family, and a life that extended far beyond that one aspect of her existence. Advocacy groups that worked with sex workers used the Craigslist killer case to argue for policy changes that would make their clients safer. They pointed out that criminalization and stigmatization of sex work made it harder for workers to screen clients, to report crimes, and to seek help when they found themselves in dangerous situations. They argued that if society genuinely cared about protecting vulnerable women like Julissa Brisman, then policies needed to change to create safer working conditions, rather than driving sex work further underground, where predators could more easily target victims. The legal implications of Philip's suicide were also significant. Because he died before trial, he was never formally convicted of any crime. In the eyes of the law, he remained innocent, a legal fiction that was deeply frustrating to the victims and their families. The criminal cases against him were dismissed, the charges dropped, the proceedings ended. The overwhelming evidence of his guilt existed, had been compiled, and was part of the public record, but there was no official legal determination of culpability, no conviction to point to as proof that justice had been served. This legal reality created practical problems as well. Julissa Brisman's family would have had the right to pursue civil litigation against Philip's estate for wrongful death, seeking monetary damages as a form of accountability, even if criminal justice was no longer possible. But with Philip dead and his estate consisting primarily of student loan debt, there was little practical value in pursuing such a lawsuit. The family's desire for accountability, for some official recognition that Philip had wronged them, had to remain unfulfilled. The other victims faced similar frustrations. They could not pursue civil claims with any realistic hope of recovery. They could not testify in court as they had prepared to do. They could not experience whatever healing might have come from confronting their attacker and seeing him held accountable. Philip's suicide denied them all of these things, leaving them with trauma, but without the traditional mechanisms of justice that might have helped them process and move past that trauma. In the years following Philip's death, true crime media would return to his story repeatedly. Books were written analyzing the case, exploring Philip's psychology, examining the broader questions about internet safety and the hidden lives that people lead. Television programs produced documentaries about the Craigslist killer, often sensationalizing aspects of the case, sometimes focusing more on the lurid details than on the victim's humanity. The story became part of the cultural conversation about online danger, about the masks that people wear, about the difficulty of truly knowing another person. Some of this coverage was thoughtful and respectful. Journalists and authors who took the time to understand the full context produced work that honored Julissa Brisman's memory, that respected the other victims' experiences, and that grappled seriously with the complex questions the case raised. But much of the coverage was exploitative, treating the case as entertainment, focusing on the most shocking elements, using provocative language and imagery to attract audiences without sufficient consideration for the real people whose lives had been destroyed. Julissa's family largely avoided engaging with this media coverage. They gave occasional interviews in the immediate aftermath of Philip's death, expressing their grief and frustration, but they generally chose to grieve privately rather than becoming public figures in the ongoing conversation about the case. They established a memorial fund in Julissa's name, supporting causes she had cared about, trying to ensure that her legacy would be more than just her tragic death. They spoke of her dreams, her kindness, her work ethic, her love for her family. They tried to reclaim her story from the media narratives that reduced her to a victim, a cautionary tale, a supporting character in Philip Markoff's story. The question of whether Philip had additional victims beyond those identified by investigators has been a subject of ongoing speculation. His pattern of using Craigslist to find targets, his mobility as a medical student who could travel relatively freely, and the possibility that other women who were robbed chose not to report the crimes all suggest that there may have been additional incidents. Investigators in various jurisdictions reviewed unsolved robberies and assaults from the time period when Philip was active, looking for cases that matched his method of operation. Some possible connections were identified, but without the ability to interview Philip or to access additional evidence, these remained speculative. The broader impact on Craigslist and similar online platforms was significant. The site had already been facing pressure from law enforcement and advocacy groups to shut down or heavily regulate its adult services sections. The Craigslist killer case intensified this pressure, providing a high-profile example of the dangers that could arise from anonymous online interactions. Craigslist eventually removed its adult services category entirely, though this simply displaced such advertisements to other platforms, rather than eliminating the underlying market. The case also contributed to broader cultural anxieties about internet safety in the late 2000s. This was a period when online interaction was becoming increasingly common, but when many people still viewed the internet with some suspicion and concern. The idea that a killer could be lurking behind a seemingly innocuous Craigslist post, that danger could be just a click away, resonated with existing fears about online predators, catfishing, and the risks of interacting with strangers through digital platforms. The case became a cautionary tale that parents shared with children, that friends shared with each other. A reminder that the person on the other end of an online interaction might not be who they claim to be. For medical schools and other professional programs, the case raised difficult questions about screening and student evaluation. How could institutions identify students who might be dangerous? What warning signs should trigger intervention? How could schools balance the need to support students who were struggling with legitimate mental health issues against the need to protect potential victims from students who posed a danger? These questions had no easy answers, and the Philip Markoff case served as a stark reminder that even people who appeared successful and well-adjusted could be harboring dark secrets. The forensic psychology community studied the case extensively, incorporating it into training programs for profilers and criminal investigators. Philip's case became an example of the difficulty of identifying certain types of offenders, particularly those who are intelligent, educated, and skilled at maintaining a facade of normalcy. Traditional criminal profiling often focuses on offenders who show obvious signs of dysfunction, social marginalization, or prior criminal activity. But Philip fit none of these patterns, and his case demonstrated the limitations of relying too heavily on stereotypical profiles when investigating crimes. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the messages Philip wrote on the wall of his jail cell before committing suicide. These messages, addressed to Megan, expressed love and what appeared to be regret, though the specific wording was never fully disclosed to the public. Some who saw the messages interpreted them as evidence that Philip did feel genuine remorse, that in his final hours he was confronting the reality of what he had done and experiencing grief for the pain he had caused. Others interpreted the messages more cynically, seeing them as a final manipulation, a last attempt to control how he would be remembered, particularly in Megan's memory. The anniversary of Philip's suicide on August 15 was particularly painful for Megan. It was exactly 1 year after he had proposed to her. What should have been a happy memory now forever tainted by his death and the knowledge of his crimes. The symbolism of choosing that specific date for his suicide seemed deliberate, a final message to Megan, though whether it was meant as an expression of love, regret, or something darker remained unclear. Megan would later tell friends that she struggled with the anniversary, feeling a complex mixture of grief for the loss of the future she had imagined, relief that the ordeal was over, and continued confusion about who Philip really was, and whether anything about their relationship had been real. The physical evidence from Philip's crimes was eventually destroyed according to standard protocols once the legal proceedings were concluded with his death. The gun that had killed Julissa Brisman was melted down. The items taken from victims that had been recovered from Philip's apartment were returned to the victims or disposed of if the victims didn't want them back. The plastic restraints, the computer hard drive, the various pieces of evidence that had been collected were processed through the evidence disposal procedures. In a physical sense, the traces of Philip's crimes were gradually erased, though the psychological and emotional impact would endure far longer. The investigation into Philip Markoff's life continued even after his death, driven partly by investigators' professional thoroughness, and partly by a genuine need to understand how someone with such apparent promise could commit such horrific acts. Detectives combed through every aspect of Philip's background, interviewing dozens of people who had known him at various stages of his life, searching for patterns or warning signs that might have been missed in real time. What emerged from this exhaustive investigation was a portrait of a young man who had been skilled at presenting different versions of himself to different audiences, but who had also left subtle traces of the darkness that lurked beneath his carefully constructed exterior. Investigators spoke with Philip's former teachers from high school, hoping to find some indication of troubled behavior during his adolescence. Most remembered him as a quiet, unremarkable student who completed his work adequately but didn't stand out in any particular way. One teacher recalled that Philip seemed to struggle socially after his father's death, becoming more withdrawn and less engaged with his peers. But this was attributed at the time to normal grief rather than any deeper psychological disturbance. Another teacher mentioned that Philip had occasionally made comments that seemed dismissive of women, small remarks that might have been written off as typical adolescent immaturity, but that in retrospect suggested possible misogynistic attitudes that would later manifest in his choice of victims. College friends and acquaintances from Suing Albany provided a somewhat more revealing picture. Several people remembered Philip as being intensely focused on his relationship with Megan to the exclusion of other friendships. He didn't participate much in the social life of the pre-med program beyond what was necessary for academic networking. He attended study groups but rarely joined classmates for casual social gatherings. Some interpreted this as simple dedication to his studies and his relationship, but others recalled finding it slightly odd. As if Philip was going through the motions of being a normal college student, without actually engaging in any authentic way. One former classmate told investigators about a troubling incident that had occurred during their sophomore year. A female student in their biology class had rejected Philip's request for a date, and according to this witness, Philip's reaction had been disproportionately angry. He had made bitter comments about the woman, suggesting she thought she was too good for him, and had seemed to hold a grudge for weeks afterward. The incident was minor enough that no one had thought much of it at the time, but in retrospect it suggested that Philip struggled with rejection, and may have harbored resentment toward women who didn't conform to his expectations. Investigators also uncovered some financial irregularities in Philip's background that predated his known crimes. During his undergraduate years, Philip had been accused of using someone else's credit card information to make online purchases. The incident had been resolved informally, with Philip claiming it was a misunderstanding and paying back the money, and no formal charges had been filed. But this early instance of fraud suggested that Philip's criminal behavior may have started earlier than the Craigslist robberies, that he had been willing to steal and deceive to get what he wanted, even before the more serious crimes of 2009. The digital forensic analysis of Philip's computer and online activity revealed a more extensive pattern of concerning behavior. Beyond the emails to his eventual victims and the searches for escort advertisements on Craigslist, investigators found evidence that Philip had been visiting violent pornography sites and forums where users discussed sexual violence. The content he accessed included scenarios of domination, bondage, and violence against women. While consumption of such material doesn't automatically indicate that someone will commit violent crimes, in Philip's case it suggested a fantasy life that aligned with, and may have fueled his actual criminal behavior. More disturbing was evidence that Philip had been researching how to commit crimes without getting caught. His search history included queries about DNA evidence, about how police trace digital communications, about surveillance camera systems in hotels, and about how criminals are identified through forensic investigation. This research demonstrated clear premeditation and planning. Philip wasn't acting impulsively or out of desperation. He was carefully preparing to commit crimes, studying how to minimize the risk of getting caught, approaching robbery and potentially murder with the same methodical mindset he applied to his medical studies. The timeline that investigators were able to construct suggested that Philip's escalation into violence had been gradual rather than sudden. The digital evidence showed that he had been browsing Craigslist's adult services section for months before committing his first known robbery. During this period, he may have been fantasizing about committing crimes, developing the psychological permission he needed to cross the line from fantasy to action. The first robbery in early April 2009 had been successful from his perspective. He got money and wasn't caught. This success likely reinforced his behavior, making a second crime more likely. The murder of Julissa Brisman represented a critical escalation. Prior to that, Philip had used his gun as a threat, but had not physically harmed his victims beyond the psychological trauma of being terrorized. Julissa's resistance forced him to make a choice in the moment, and the choice he made revealed the depths of his capacity for violence. Some criminal psychologists who studied the case believed that this crossing of the line into murder may have been intoxicating for Philip, that the power he felt in taking a life may have fundamentally changed him. The fact that he committed another robbery just 2 days later, seemingly unfazed by having killed someone, suggested that whatever moral constraints might have once existed had completely dissolved. The investigation also revealed that Philip had been under significant financial pressure in the months before the crimes. Medical school is expensive, and both Philip and Megan were relying on student loans that would leave them with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Planning a wedding added additional financial stress. Credit card statements showed that Philip had been spending beyond his means, accumulating debt on things like Meghan's engagement ring, wedding deposits, and daily expenses that his student budget couldn't support. While financial pressure doesn't excuse or fully explain his crimes, it may have been a contributing factor, the trigger that pushed him from fantasy into action. But there were also indications that Philip's crimes were about more than just money. The items he kept as trophies, the women's underwear found hidden in his apartment, suggested a sexual psychological component to his offending that went beyond simple robbery. Criminal profilers noted that taking intimate items from victims is often associated with power and control motivations, rather than financial gain. Philip may have been seeking a sense of dominance and mastery over women that he felt was lacking in other areas of his life. In his relationship with Meghan, he may have felt pressure to be the devoted, perfect fiancé. In medical school, he was average rather than exceptional. But in hotel rooms with terrified women at gunpoint, he was completely in control. The psychological analysis of Philip's suicide also revealed important insights. The manner of his death, using medical knowledge to ensure success, writing messages to Meghan on the wall, choosing the anniversary of his proposal to her, all suggested a final attempt to control the narrative of his life. By killing himself, Philip ensured that his victims and their families could never confront him in court, that he would never have to publicly account for his actions, that the full truth of his motivations and the extent of his crimes might never be known. Some psychologists interpreted this as a final act of narcissism, Philip making himself the center of the story even in death, denying closure to those he had harmed. The messages Philip wrote to Meghan before his death were analyzed by handwriting experts and psychologists. While the specific content was not fully released to the public, those who saw the messages noted that they expressed love and what appeared to be regret, but in ways that were self-focused rather than genuinely empathetic. Philip wrote about his own suffering, his own loss, his own pain, with less attention to the pain he had caused Julissa Brisman and the other victims. This self-centeredness, even in his final communications, was consistent with narcissistic or psychopathic personality traits. The impact of Philip's crimes on the medical profession extended beyond Boston University. Medical schools across the country reviewed their ethics curricula, their student evaluation processes, and their procedures for identifying students who might pose a danger to patients or others. The case raised difficult questions about whether medical training, with its emphasis on scientific detachment and emotional control, might in some cases reinforce problematic psychological tendencies rather than correcting them. Philip had been taught to compartmentalize emotion when dealing with patients, to maintain professional distance, to focus on the task at hand rather than being overwhelmed by empathy for suffering. Had this training somehow made it easier for him to compartmentalize his criminal behavior? Most experts concluded that medical training itself was not to blame, that millions of physicians learned to balance professional detachment with genuine compassion, and that Philip's crimes reflected his individual pathology, rather than any systematic problem with medical education. But the case did lead to increased attention to physician mental health, to the importance of screening for antisocial traits during admissions, and to the need for better support systems for students struggling with the intense pressures of medical training. The trauma experienced by Philip's victims extended far beyond the immediate physical danger and financial loss they suffered. The women he robbed at gunpoint experienced profound psychological effects that persisted long after the incidents themselves. Tricia Leffler, the woman he robbed on April 10, 2009, spoke publicly about her experience and its aftermath. She described the terror of having a gun pointed at her, of being bound and helpless, of not knowing whether she would live or die. She described the shame she initially felt about her work advertising massage services, the fear of judgment that made her hesitant to report the crime. And she described the rage she felt when she learned that just 4 days after robbing her, Philip had killed Julissa Brisman. Tricia struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder in the months and years following the robbery. She experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and severe anxiety, particularly around men who resembled Philip. She had difficulty trusting people and struggled with the knowledge that someone who seemed normal and even charming in initial contact could be hiding murderous intent. She eventually sought therapy and slowly worked through the trauma, but the experience fundamentally changed how she viewed the world and her place in it. She also changed her work, moving away from advertising services on Craigslist and finding other ways to support herself that felt safer. The woman robbed in Rhode Island 2 days after Julissa's murder also experienced severe psychological trauma. She spoke less publicly than Tricia, but conveyed through victim impact statements the lasting effects of Philip's attack. She described feeling violated not just by the robbery itself, but by the knowledge that Philip had used her vulnerability against her, that he had deliberately targeted women in the sex industry, because he knew they were less likely to seek help from police. She described the difficulty of reconciling her need for justice with the reality that Philip's suicide had denied her the opportunity to face him in court. For Julissa Brisman's family, the loss was both immediate and enduring. Her mother, Carmen Guzman, became a vocal advocate for justice in her daughter's case, though Philip's suicide left her with limited options for obtaining that justice. Carmen spoke publicly about Julissa, trying to ensure that her daughter was remembered as more than just a victim, more than just a name in a true crime story. She described Julissa's dreams of helping her family, of building a better life in America, of using her intelligence and work ethic to create opportunities that hadn't been available to her in Chile. Carmen also spoke about the specific pain of being unable to afford to bring Julissa's body back to Chile for burial. The cost of international body transport was beyond the family's means, and they had to hold memorial services without Julissa physically present. This added a layer of grief to an already unbearable loss, the sense that even in death, Julissa remained separated from her home and family. Eventually, through the help of victim services organizations and donations from people moved by Julissa's story, arrangements were made to have her remains returned to Chile. But the delay and difficulty added to the family's suffering. The media coverage of Julissa's death was a source of both comfort and pain for her family. On one hand, the attention meant that her story was told, that her death was not simply forgotten, that there was public acknowledgement of the injustice of what had happened to her. On the other hand, the way her story was told, often focusing on her work advertising massage services rather than on her as a complete human being, felt reductive and sometimes exploitative. Her family had to read headlines that described their daughter as an escort or prostitute, terms that carried judgment and stigma, overshadowing the complexity of who Julissa actually was. Some media coverage was more thoughtful, presenting Julissa's story with nuance and respect. Journalists who took the time to interview her family and friends produced pieces that honored her memory and explored the economic and social factors that led women like Julissa to advertise services on Craigslist. These stories acknowledge that the sex industry exists in a complex space where economics, choice, exploitation, and survival intersect in ways that defy simple moral judgments. They recognize that women like Julissa deserve the same compassion and justice as any other crime victim, regardless of how they made their living. The question of what could have been done differently to prevent Philip's crimes has been endlessly debated. Could Megan have recognized warning signs in Philip's behavior? Should Boston University have had better screening processes for medical students? Should Craigslist have implemented stronger safety measures for its users? Should there have been intervention after the incident during Philip's undergraduate years when he was accused of credit card fraud? Each of these questions implies a failure point, a moment when different choices might have changed the outcome. But the reality is that prevention is extraordinarily difficult when dealing with someone as skilled at deception as Philip appeared to be. Megan lived with him, was intimate with him in every sense, and saw no signs of the violence he was capable of. His professors and classmates interacted with him regularly and noticed nothing alarming. He had no criminal record prior to the Craigslist robberies, nothing that would have flagged him in background checks. He was intelligent enough to hide his tracks, careful enough to avoid obvious mistakes until the investigation closed in on him. The uncomfortable truth is that some people are very good at hiding who they really are, and no system of screening or surveillance can catch every dangerous individual before they act. The changes that did occur in the aftermath of Philip's crimes were primarily focused on internet safety and platform responsibility. Craigslist, facing intense pressure and negative publicity, made significant changes to its adult services section and eventually eliminated it entirely. Other online platforms and stricter verification processes and safety warnings. Law enforcement agencies developed better protocols for investigating crimes committed through online platforms and for tracking digital evidence. These changes may have prevented some subsequent crimes, though the underlying demand for online adult services simply migrated to other platforms that were sometimes even less regulated than Craigslist had been. The sex worker advocacy community used Philip's crimes to argue for decriminalization and better safety protections for people working in the sex industry. They pointed out that criminalization and stigmatization made it harder for workers to screen clients, to report crimes, and to seek police protection when threatened. If sex work were treated as legitimate work subject to regulation rather than criminalization, they argued, workers would be safer and predators like Philip would have a harder time exploiting the vulnerability that illegality creates. These arguments gained some traction in certain jurisdictions, though overall American policy remained largely prohibitionist. The wedding that Philip and Meghan had planned for August 2009 never happened, of course. The venue was canceled, deposits were lost. Save the date cards that had been sent to friends and family became bitter reminders of a future that would never arrive. Meghan had to contact everyone who had been planning to attend, explaining that the wedding was off, dealing with their questions and expressions of sympathy, and sometimes morbid curiosity. Some people in her life were supportive, understanding that she too was a victim of Philip's deception. Others were less kind, suggesting that she should have known something was wrong, implying that her judgment was suspect for having been engaged to a killer. Meghan's journey of recovery was long and difficult. She completed her medical education, though she transferred to a different school to escape the associations with Philip and the media attention that continued to follow her at Boston University. She eventually began practicing medicine, finding some healing in the work of actually helping patients, doing the work that Philip had claimed to value but had betrayed through his actions. She changed her name professionally, not wanting to be forever identified as Philip Markoff's former fiancé. And she largely avoided speaking publicly about the case, granting only a few interviews in the years following Philip's death. In one of those rare interviews, conducted several years after the events, Meghan spoke about the process of coming to terms with what had happened. She described the cognitive dissonance of knowing intellectually that Philip had committed terrible crimes, while emotionally still remembering the person she thought he was. She talked about the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine memories of their relationship and what in retrospect seemed like lies and manipulation. She described the guilt she felt, the irrational but persistent sense that she should have known, should have seen the signs, should have somehow prevented what happened. And she spoke about the gradual process of rebuilding her sense of trust in her own judgment and in other people. Philip's mother and brother also struggled to rebuild their lives in the shadow of his crimes. They faced social stigma, curious stares, and sometimes outright hostility from people who blamed them for Philip's actions, or who simply wanted to distance themselves from any association with the family of a killer. They moved away from the area where Philip had grown up, seeking fresh starts in places where their name didn't carry the weight of infamy. They sought therapy to process their grief and confusion, trying to reconcile the son and brother they had known with the killer he had become. In private conversations with investigators, Philip's mother spoke about the guilt she felt, wondering whether she had failed as a parent, whether her son's father's death had affected Philip in ways she hadn't recognized, whether there had been moments in his childhood when intervention might have changed his path. Investigators assured her that Philip's crimes were his own responsibility, that nothing in his upbringing obviously predicted or excused what he had done. But the guilt of a parent whose child commits terrible acts is not so easily dismissed by rational arguments. The question of Philip's true body count, whether he had committed crimes beyond those identified by investigators, remained open. After his death, cold case investigators in various jurisdictions reviewed unsolved robberies and assaults that might match his pattern. Several cases were identified as possible matches. Incidents where women advertising services on Craigslist or similar platforms had been robbed at gunpoint in hotels by a man matching Philip's description. But without the ability to interview Philip or to access additional physical evidence linking him to these cases, they remained officially unsolved. There was also speculation about whether Philip might have committed other types of crimes earlier in his life. Some profilers noted that the planning and comfort with violence he demonstrated in the Craigslist robberies suggested that these might not have been his first criminal acts. Perhaps there had been earlier assaults, thefts, or other incidents that simply hadn't been reported or connected to him. But without concrete evidence, these remain matters of speculation rather than confirmed facts. The physical locations where Philip's crimes occurred became sites of somber reflection for some people. The Marriott Copley Place, where Julissa Brisman was murdered, continued operating as a hotel, though room 2009 where the murder occurred was reportedly remodeled and renumbered. Hotel staff who had been working the night of the murder struggled with the trauma of knowing that such violence had occurred in a place they thought of as safe and professional. Some eventually left their positions, unable to continue working in the building where Julissa had died. The apartment in Quincy that Philip had shared with Megan was eventually rented to new tenants, who may or may not have been aware of its history. The building where the apartment was located became a minor landmark of sorts, occasionally visited by true crime enthusiasts who wanted to see where the Craigslist killer had lived. This kind of dark tourism was distressing to other residents of the building, who resented the association and the occasional intrusions of curiosity seekers. The legacy of Philip Markoff and the crimes he committed extends far beyond the immediate circle of victims and families he destroyed. His story became a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of internet culture, a dark example used by parents warning children about online dangers, by law enforcement training officers on cybercrime, and by advocates pushing for better protections in the digital marketplace. The phrase, Craigslist killer, entered the cultural lexicon, forever linking Philip's name to a specific type of predatory behavior that exploited the anonymity and trust inherent in online transactions. In the years following his death, numerous books, documentaries, and television programs examined the case from various angles. Some focused on the investigative process, the meticulous police work that identified Philip and built the case against him in just 6 days. Others explored the psychological dimensions, attempting to understand how a medical student could commit such crimes. Still others centered on the victims, particularly Julissa Brisman, trying to honor their humanity and ensure they were remembered as more than footnotes in a killer's story. The most comprehensive documentary treatment came several years after Philip's death, featuring interviews with investigators, family members of victims, and experts in forensic psychology. The program traced Philip's life from childhood through medical school to his crimes and eventual suicide, attempting to identify the trajectory that led from apparent normalcy to murder. What emerged was a portrait of a deeply troubled individual who had learned early to hide his true nature, who had cultivated a facade of success and normalcy, while harboring darkness that eventually erupted into violence. Julissa Brisman's family participated in some of this media coverage, though selectively. They wanted to ensure that Julissa was remembered accurately, not just as a victim but as a person with dreams, talents, and people who loved her. They established a scholarship in her name for young women pursuing education, a tangible way to honor her memory and create something positive from tragedy. The scholarship helped several young women attend college, carrying forward Julissa's own commitment to education and self-improvement. The other victims, those who survived Philip's robberies, had mixed feelings about the media attention. Some found it therapeutic to tell their stories publicly, to reclaim narrative control and transform their experiences from shameful secrets into testimonies of survival. Others preferred privacy, wanting to move past the trauma rather than repeatedly reliving it through interviews and public discussions. Both choices were valid responses to the impossible situation Philip had forced them into. Craigslist itself underwent significant changes, partly in response to Philip's crimes. The adult services section that had facilitated his contact with victims was first modified with additional screening requirements, then eventually shut down entirely in 2010. Company executives cited the Craigslist killer case among the factors that led to this decision, though they also noted ongoing pressure from law enforcement and advocacy groups. The closure of this section didn't eliminate online sex work advertising, it simply displaced it to other platforms, some of which had even fewer safety protections than Craigslist had provided. The broader conversation about internet safety that Philip's crime sparked led to some positive developments. Online platforms developed better reporting mechanisms for suspicious behavior. Law enforcement agencies created specialized units for investigating crimes committed through digital platforms. Educational programs taught people, particularly people in vulnerable populations, about the risks of meeting strangers contacted online and strategies for safer interactions. But these changes came too late for Julissa Brisman. She remained the permanent victim of Philip's escalation, the woman whose resistance to being robbed cost her everything. Her death certificate listed the cause as homicide by gunshot, clinical language that captured the mechanism but not the meaning of her loss. She was buried eventually in Chile, returned to the land of her birth. Her dreams of building a life in America ended forever. Megan McAllister rebuilt her life slowly, painfully, learning to trust again while carrying the knowledge of how profoundly she had been deceived. She eventually married someone else years later, though friends said she approached that relationship with understandable caution, always aware that people can hide their true natures. She became a physician and by all accounts is good at her work, bringing compassion to patients while maintaining the professional boundaries her training taught her. She rarely speaks of Philip, and when she does, it's with a kind of detached sadness, as if discussing someone she once knew but no longer fully understands. Philip's grave is marked with a simple headstone bearing his name and dates. It's located in a cemetery in upstate New York, far from the crimes that made him infamous. His family visits occasionally, still mourning the son and brother they thought they knew, still grappling with the reality of who he actually was. The grave receives no pilgrimages from true crime enthusiasts, no flowers from strangers. It's a quiet resting place for someone whose life ended in noise and violence and unanswered questions. The fundamental question that Philip's case raises, the question that haunts everyone who studies it deeply, is how well we can really know another person. Philip fooled everyone in his life, his family, his fiancée, his professors, his classmates. He maintained his facade until the moment of his arrest, and even then he revealed nothing through confession or explanation. He took his secrets to his grave, leaving behind only evidence and speculation, facts without full understanding. In the end, Philip Markoff's story is a tragedy in multiple dimensions. It's the tragedy of Julissa Brisman, a young woman murdered while trying to build a better life. It's the tragedy of the other victims, robbed and terrorized and left with lasting trauma. It's the tragedy of Megan McAllister, betrayed by the person she trusted most. It's the tragedy of Philip's family, forced to live with the knowledge of what their son and brother became. And in a certain sense, it's the tragedy of Philip himself, a young man who might have become a physician, who might have helped people, but who instead chose violence and died alone in a jail cell, having destroyed multiple lives including his own. The case remains a touchstone in discussions of internet safety, criminal psychology, and the masks that people wear. It reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, that the person sitting beside us in class or across from us at dinner might be harboring darkness we cannot see. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that makes the world feel less safe, less predictable. But it's a truth that the lives and deaths connected to Philip Markoff force us to confront. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.